And we're going to talk business now. What's the thinking in the business community, and what is happening with companies moving their registered office down south? Is it right to do this? And in terms of the general business arguments, what are the arguments for and against? Well, joining me now is Ivan McKee from Business for Scotland and the businessman and blogger Kevin Hague. Good afternoon to both of you.
Good afternoon.
Now, you've both shared the old platform or two before, so you fairly know each other. Can I ask you both, first of all, as business blogs, what's the significance of a company moving a registered office or a brass plate south of the border? Ivan first.
Well, it's a legal requirement if you're going to operate in a separate country. I mean, I've got businesses across, worked in several countries, businesses across about 4 or 5 countries at the moment. And by and large, if you're going to do business in another country, then you set up a registered office there. It's a kind of legal requirement. So the fact that companies are setting up legal entities, are talking about setting up separate legal entities, all that means is they recognise there's going to be 2 separate countries, and it doesn't mean anything more than that. In fact, it's been quite interesting, the statements coming out today, the clarifications, if you like. RBS, for example, saying it's got no impact at all on jobs, and neither would it, because, as I say, it's only moving a brass nameplate.
Before I move on now, the RBS one is different, isn't it? Because the RBS, they're going to move the head office down south.
Well, I think all the people that are working in the head office are down there anyway.
Okay.
And the vast majority of RBS's businesses south of the border, less than 10% of their employees are in Scotland in any event.
Okay, Kevin Hague, why would you move south of the border?
If I just very briefly respond to Ivan's point, because the purpose of getting companies to register in that country, particularly in the banking sector, where it's about lender of last resort support, is to get the profit, to get the tax take. Otherwise, it would be a pointless exercise. It's there for a reason. In terms of my businesses, back to the smaller scale world, the 100-odd employees in West Lothian that are employed in my .com businesses, we move south to avoid being exporters, to avoid being exposed to exchange rate risks or different currency risks, to avoid being exposed to border costs, to avoid being exposed to the risk of having to export either from the EU out of it or out of the EU into it when we're trading with the rest of the UK.
So, Ivan, how many businesses have you got? Where are the registered offices?
Well, at the moment, I've got business registered in Scotland, business registered in England, I think 2, businesses registered in Croatia, businesses registered in Bosnia, and until last year, I had a business registered in Estonia as well.
And where do they all pay their tax?
Well, where they're registered.
Right.
And the way you structure it is, complex large businesses have typically got quite a complex structure with a notional kind of holding company, if you like, and then various subsidiaries at different levels, a big kind of family tree thing, and they'll be registered in all different countries, and depending on where they make the profit in whatever country, that's where they'll pay the tax. And if you think about the examples we talk about, your Amazons and your Starbucks, whatever, they've always got very, very complicated situations and use it to their advantage. But that's the way it works, and anybody that's worked in business of that size knows that's how it is, and say they pay the tax based on where they do the business. It all doesn't roll up to the head office, it gets paid wherever the subsidiaries are making the profit as well.
So your business that's based in Scotland, can I ask how many people are employed in that business and what sort of level of tax are you paying?
Well, the business we've got in Scotland employs about 80 people at the moment.
The business that's registered in Scotland?
Well, the structure we've got at the moment for historical reasons, the business that's operating in Scotland is registered in England.
So you're paying your tax so you'd be paying your tax in England?
HMRC, as everybody does.
But in an independent Scotland...
In an independent Scotland, we would move that head office to Scotland.
So you would move the head office to Scotland?
We would, yeah.
For the 3%
Hang on, can I just clear? Stop interrupting, stop it. So the First Minister, when he was on his feet, said you don't pay the tax where the registered office is, you pay the tax where the economic activity is. So you just told me you pay the tax. Well, let's be clear. You start then, Kevin.
Yeah.
Do you pay the tax where you do the business, or if you move your headquarters and register somewhere else, do you pay the tax there? Would we lose the tax income?
You pay the tax where the registered company is that's working in that country. And if you're in a country, you need to have a registered company in that country. When you talk about head office, you're talking about large, complex companies that have got many different legal entities in that kind of family tree structure. So each of those legal entities that's based in a separate country will be paying tax in that separate country.
And the reality of that is, as evidenced by Google at the moment, for example, with it taking profit in Ireland for the 12.5% tax rate, despite having activities in the UK, and it's coming under a lot of pressure because you get to a point of how do you define economic activity versus where registered office is, and ultimately that's down to accountants and lawyers. You can rest assured the reason why the English government insists that banks that have the majority of their activity are in England, or the rest of the UK we should say, the reason why they ask people to register there is so they can get that tax take. Otherwise it would be pointless pointless. And they don't do these things for no reason. It's
that's-
GDP leaving Scotland.
No, that's clear. I mean, you look at RBS, I think RBS operates in 30-odd countries at the moment. They'll have legal entities right across the world. Standard Life's in about a dozen countries at the moment. They'll be making profit and paying tax in each of those countries. And then the head office is just a kind of roll-up consolidation of all the different activities
So
got
why
around
do you
the
think
world.
it's a legal requirement that they re-register their head office in England?
Because, as I said before, it's going to be two separate countries. You need two separate legal entities. That's the way it works. And if they've got what countries they're in, but Standard Life are in Ireland, they're in Canada, they're in all kinds of countries. They've got a legal entity in each of those countries.
And where's
each
the
of those
majority
countries.
of their activity? RBS, majority of their activity is in England.
Well, the more than vast
it's where the
majority-
activity
yeah.
is at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
so
what
that-
they'll carry on doing, the 10% or so of their business that's in Scotland, they would carry on as a separate Scottish legal entity. They'd be paying tax on the profits in that business
and
in
on the
Scotland.
10%. So 90% of the tax take from RBS, let's just take the UK tax take, would move south of the border.
Yeah, but let's be clear about that. At the moment, RBS doesn't make any
not
money
paying tax.
anyway.
It's not
Right,
paying
doesn't make any
tax,
money.
isn't it?
Right, but the second point, of course, is that the tax that RBS was paying in previous years was never ever included in the GEARS accounts for Scotland anyway. So when we look at Scotland's financial performance over the past years and the past decades, the profit from those big companies was never included in Scotland's financial accounts in any event.
I'm enjoying this because I did tax for 4 years, but nobody else is enjoying it. Let's open it up.
Yeah.
Spell out the benefits for business on a yes vote, Ivan McKee. What's the benefit?
we see
What's your key message?
We see it as a great opportunity for first of all, there's wealth in Scotland that doesn't stay in Scotland, and that's an important message. We've generated, if you look back over history, we've generated more tax per person than the UK average. We've got more spent on it, but when you look at it in balance, the difference between those, if we'd had all that tax take stayed in Scotland, we'd have been a richer country. So there's an opportunity to keep wealth in Scotland. The second point is it's policies that are going to be focused on what's important for Scottish business. If you look at, I mean, I've travelled and worked in many countries across Europe. Most countries in Europe have got manufacturing sectors that are about twice the size of the UK and Scotland's, and that's because of the crazy policies we've had from Westminster over past decades that have deindustrialised Scotland and the UK. We've got an opportunity to reverse that by doing what some of these other very successful small countries have done, by having government policies that focus on manufacturing sectors. And thirdly, Brand Scotland will get a huge boost. I mean, the profile we're getting already around the world is significant. Brand Scotland for tourism, for people going and doing business in Scotland with Scottish companies is going to get a huge boost, and that supports your premium food and drink exports, etc. And the other thing, of course, is you talk about balance of payment. Scotland has a significant positive balance of payment situation, unlike the UK that's got a very large balance of payments deficit. So in fact, we've got oil and gas, whisky, food and drink exports out of Scotland. Scotland's going to have foreign reserves coming in on the back of that balance of payment surplus.
Okay, Kevin, your turn.
Well, let me respond to each of those points. I mean, the first point, which Ivan knows very well, actually, because we've debated this at length and we've exchanged numbers on this. Scotland would not be a wealthier country standalone. Yes, we generate more tax. The amount we generate in more tax is offset by what we incur in additional spending. I've sat at this table with you before, John, and been through the famous £8 billion figure, which we all know is actually could only be achieved by Scotland incurring greater debt, which Ivan has argued it should have done in the last 5 years. In fact, and I would just take an aside point, I would, Ivan, ask you if you have intellectual integrity. In fact, if you have integrity, I would suggest you get taken off your website the statement, if Scotland had been independent 5 years ago, it would have generated a surplus of 8.3 billion over this period compared to being part of the UK. Now, I know, you know, that's not true.
No, that is true. It's absolutely true. If Scotland had had back the same percentage of spend from the UK as the percentage of tax it's raised over that time, it would have been £8.5 billion better off.
Sorry.
That's a fact.
If Scotland had been standalone...
Yeah, if Scotland had been standalone...
where would the extra tax have come from?
If Scotland had been standalone and ran the same economic model that the UK had ran in terms of its deficit, percentage of GDP,
right.
Deficit,
so it could have run a higher
income,
deficit.
Well, we'd run a deficit commensurate with what the deficit...
So we'd have incurred more debt.
It'd have ran a deficit commensurate with the deficit that the UK's run. Now,
which means incurring more debt.
Let me finish here. And the other point, of course, is, as you know fine well, the UK's ran that huge deficit, much larger than Scotland would have ran as a percentage of GDP, but Scotland's accounts include our share of paying the interest on that huge deficit, which came to £4.1 billion. So that's the reality. The UK's running up the debt, Scotland's paying its share of that debt, but we are not generating that debt to the same level that the UK is. And that's the problem.
Okay. And as Ivan knows, we are generating the debt to the same level on a per capita basis. Ivan's argument is we could afford to generate more debt because of our GDP. That means he's arguing we would have generated more debt. So anyway, that was his first point, wealth. It's nonsense. People who believe that just by becoming independent we're wealthier and that helps business, it's just not true. Second point is a rather sort of ill-defined answer that we always get from the yes side. And I've asked many people. I've asked Fergus Ewing. I've asked Blair McDougall. Blair Jenkins. What are the real upsides for business? If we can talk about the downsides, what are the upsides? And all we ever get is some loose answer that points towards other countries that are doing better in some area and saying, we'll do that will have job-creating powers. And you say, well, what are these job-creating powers? How are you going to use them? And at which point, you just get more bluster and sound bites. And I've yet to meet a business person who sees independence as being a business opportunity, as being a job-creating opportunity.
You've got one across the desk. Come on, Ivan, you've got to respond.
I've already gone through them. I talked about Brand Scotland. I talked about international profile. I talked about... it's very difficult to say. If you look across the world, right, you look across the world and you say, these countries are doing much, much better than us. We should be doing as well as them because we've got more natural resources, vastly more natural resources in most of those countries. Why are we not doing as well? And then you look at the policies of the UK government, which are focused on what makes the City of London happy. That's what they're concerned about, because that's frankly where their biggest tax take comes from, so you can understand it. They don't care about manufacturing. They've allowed it to run down over the decades. They haven't focused on it. If you look at industrial policies, it's all about having an industrial policy, which the UK is shied away from. You compare it to a range of countries across Europe, be it Germany, be it Scandinavian countries, Finland, Sweden, Denmark,
so Ivan, give
Austria.
us a... Hang on,
don't interrupt, please.
All with much stronger manufacturing sectors than we have, because they've got industrial policies and they focus on sectors that work. So it's all about defining what you want to do, having an industrial policy. There's papers published on this. Go read them. I think you'll find them very interesting on what you would do as an industrial policy, getting government, academics, in terms of research and development, the sectors together, deciding what industries you want to go on and putting focus onto that. And take an example. You want a specific example? There's Ferguson, right? We don't yet have the powers to do what we need to do with that in terms of growing the shipbuilding industry, but Ferguson's been saved and there's work there to be done to grow that. That'll be much, much easier under independent Scotland. Ask yourself the question, why is it Norway, with a wage cost more than double the wage cost in Scotland, has got a growing and thriving marine sector, employing tens of thousands more people than we do in our shrinking sector, built 100 ships last year across 38 shipyards in Norway. How did they manage to do that and we can't?
I'm letting you talk. Kevin, come back in.
Let's just respond to the Norway point very briefly. Norway, a country that has its own currency. Norway, a country that is not part of the EU. Norway, a country that set up its oil fund 90 years ago when it was feasible to do so. So it's a very... in the 1990s. Sorry, in the 1990s.
Exactly. Okay.
When it was feasible to do so. The brand Scotland...
It's feasible to do so now.
Well, not according to the government. The Scottish government's white paper's own conditions for funding an oil fund have not been met in the last 10 years and are not due to be met in any of the projections the Scottish government has provided.
I'll give you information about
I'll let you speak. The brand Scotland point, I'm involved in businesses that exploit brand Scotland. Endure, a cycle clothing business, markets itself internationally as being a Scottish brand. There is no lack of brand Scotland. Do you think people out there in international markets, when you talk about Scotland, when you talk about our cultural identity, our historical identity, you look at the Edinburgh Festival, you look, Scotland already exists as a brand. It's a powerful brand and we can exploit it. The idea that independence is required to make brand Scotland meaningful for business is nonsense.
Ivan.
Well, I don't accept that. I think we're going to get a tremendous boost from that. But if you go back and talk, you haven't answered the question. Talk about Norway. Yeah, they also speak Norwegian, but that's not an issue that means that we can't do what they've done. The reality, and you look at Finland, there's another example, country with far less natural resources than us. I've worked there for a year. I've seen what they've done with their industrial policy to develop small factories right throughout the length and breadth of that country. Excellent. Excellent. And again,
I'm always accused of giving somebody the last word. So Kevin, very briefly, and then I'll let Ivan have last word. Okay. Briefly.
So very briefly, I would just say Norway has made decisions that are very different from those in the white paper, and that's true around tax, it's true around healthcare not being free at point of use, and so to say we can mimic Norway is nonsense.
So so what you're saying is that Norway's got a thriving shipbuilding and industrial sector because they've got a different healthcare policy from us. It's just crazy, right?
I'm saying they run a very different economic model
that
from
we can do.
Beacon of social
It gives
justice
us the choice. No, what I'm arguing for Scottish independence. That's what I'm arguing for. It gives us the opportunity to take the wealth in Scotland, follow policies like other comparable countries have done, and be successful as they have, and not be held back by the union.
Ivan McKee from Business for Scotland and businessman and blogger Kevin Hague. Thank you very much indeed for both coming in.